So I'm really excited about this event. This book fills a very, very big blank in the story of this country. And it's a really important book for that reason. It's called Speaking While Female, 75 Extraordinary Speeches by American Women. And it's no surprise that Donna Rubin is the one who produced it. I've known you we have friends in common. We've known each other for many, many years. We've had some similar career paths, but it's great to have you here in this role.
And you came and spoke to my group
That was
in New
probably
York City about 15
Oh, that's
years
right.
ago.
I remember that. Yes, I do remember that. And we have some other, I just want to say, we have some in-house speechwriting celebrities here. Three of my former colleagues, or a couple of my former colleagues from the White House, Jeff Schessel, Tom Boschert, and Paul Orszalek, are sitting in the back there. Three guys who came to this to hear about women's speeches. You guys are great. And they also happen to be extraordinarily talented speechwriters, so they can give you a lot more tips than I could, I'm sure. So Donna's a former journalist. She's also a former speechwriter. She's now a consultant. She writes and speaks about thought leadership. She's very committed to figuring out ways to cultivate diverse voices, bringing those voices into the public sphere. One of her big missions is to ensure that women feel comfortable speaking, find ways to speak and platforms to speak, and also have their voices and opinions heard as part of the ongoing public dialogue in this country, which sadly, even to this day, does not happen often enough. The book actually is just a piece of a much bigger, broader project, which is to bring women's voices to the public sphere in a number of different ways. There's the book, which is an anthology, as I said, of 75 speeches. She also has what she calls the Speaking While Female Speech Bank, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a repository by genre, by speaker, it's huge repository of speeches by women, and she's adding to it all the time. It's incredible. It's really worth looking at online. And am I missing anything?
I don't think so. That was very comprehensive.
Well, there we go. So anyway, that's that. And I just want to say that, as I said at the outset, this is just a really important book. You know, the history of this country is, in fact, too often his story of this country. And it's time that it's also her story. And this book is helping us get there. So thank you so much for putting this collection together, which is amazing, and also for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
What a beautiful introduction. Thank you. I love hearing you describe it.
Yeah. I should say one other thing. In Truth in Advertising, why am I moderating tonight? Well, I like to moderate because I'm co-owner of the store, so it's fun and I enjoy it. But I have a real special, deep, profound concern about this issue. I care about this issue because I also was a former speechwriter. I was a journalist too, but I was a speechwriter for one of the people who has a speech in your collection, Hillary Rodham Clinton. So I have a deep interest in the subject, and I'm just so glad that you are bringing all these voices, especially the lesser-known voices, to people like all of you, and to hopefully many, many more people. And professors and universities and classes are contacting you because there's such a dearth of knowledge about women's voices and women's experiences and them talking about it. So that's that for me. So why don't we get started? Let's just start with the basics. What led you to do this collection?
Well, it became obvious to me that it was necessary, but how did that happen? For one thing is I do a lot of speech coaching, and I lead classes and workshops, and I would always ask the attendees and the students, sometimes it's students, what famous women speakers in history do you know about? And I would look out and see a sea of blank faces. Sometimes they would mention a Sojourner Truth, maybe Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony. More likely, they would say Michelle Obama or Hillary Clinton. But aside from that, nobody. I mean, there's just no knowledge at all that women have been speaking in American history. But if I would say, what male speakers do you know about? Well, practically any student would know Patrick Henry or Abe Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr. or John F. Kennedy or RFK or Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama. I mean, they just can rattle off the names of these men, and they associate the act of oratory, the act of rhetorical discourse with male activity. And it started to bother me. It got under my skin. I guess you could say I got kind of angry about it. And as we know, anger is a great motivator. And the other thing is I also judge speech contests, speech writing contests, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen quotes by Winston Churchill. Now, we all know that he was the hero of World War II. His rhetoric was for the ages, but really, I mean, even in speeches that had nothing to do with his time and period, always speeches by Churchill, and I thought, where are all the women?
So you had this question, and then you had to answer it, which isn't necessarily easy because they're, unlike men, women's speeches have not always been recorded. And you were trying to cover 400 years of women speaking or making their voices heard. They're actually not always speeches, which we discover in this collection. So where did you start? How did you end up with 75? Why 75? How many did you have to cull it down from? Seems like such a Herculean task.
That's about 10 questions, Lissa.
Okay, well, that's okay. I know you can answer all of them.
So I started by looking at other speech anthologies. And because I'm something of a completionist, I started collecting them and then I just couldn't stop. I bought and I bought and I bought, and I would look at them and I would open them up to the table of contents and I would see almost no speeches by women. Most of them, in fact, had no speeches by women. But nevertheless, I got very good at buying them. I bought old ones, I bought new ones. In all, I bought about 230 speech anthologies.
I didn't realize there were that many speech anthologies.
And these are only ones in the English language. And then I made a big infographic. You can see it on the website. And it's called How the History of Speech Forgot About Women's Speech. Forgot about women's speech. Now, forgot is really, it's sarcastic, of course, because no one just forgets about something. It's a process or a result of a number of influences or a number of circumstances. But the bottom line is that they didn't just care. They didn't care what women had to say. Mm-hmm. Women were speaking. You said they're not just speeches. They're speeches, they're addresses, they're testimony, often in a courtroom. They're legislative, speeches in the halls of Congress. They're all spoken. Some eulogies, sermons in a house of worship, but they're all spoken words. And women have been doing it for over 400 years. And the anthologists did not collect them. The anthologists did not do the work of digging to see that they existed, and more or less they just reinvented the wheel over and over and over again. The same old speeches, the same collections over and over, and it really frustrated me. And I felt as if it were an injustice to the women who had spoken out and had made an impact with their words, and it also was a misrepresentation of our history.
Yeah, definitely all of the above. And, this seems like it was sort of required the skill of a kind of anthropologist, archaeologist, and journalist to figure out where to go to find some of these, because you said there were a number of different kinds of official sources, but weren't there also unofficial sources?
Yeah, well, there are all kinds of sources. I mean, first of all, to be clear, the process that I was able to engage in was greatly enhanced. In fact, you could say made possible by the digitization that took place beginning in the early 2000s. And that was a huge boon to me. All kinds of old journals, old newspapers became available to all kinds of scholars and researchers that just were, it would be impossible to track them down. Otherwise, you'd be schlepping from library to library to archive to archive. So that was a big boon to me. I would say most of the research I did online, but I have visited archives. I have gone through the dusty old papers and files, and I was just determined to find diverse women. That's really important that to emphasize that this book represents the richness of variety, the different kinds of voices that make up this this thing we call women's voice. So they're women of all classes and all backgrounds, all races, different religions, different points of view, across the political spectrum. I really worked hard to make the collection, both the Speech Bank Online and this collection, representative of the widest possible diversity and I would say even cacophony of voices possible. And a lot of times the opinions, the voices clash with one another. People have differing opinions, and I think that's extremely healthy. I welcome that. I love showing people that women have different points of view about every issue that women spoke out about. There are women who argued with them and had a different point of view. And I think that's the foundation of our democracy. That should be the character of our national discourse. And so I'm proud that that's reflected in the book.
Yeah, and we'll follow up in a sec with the range of professions, kinds of work, careers, in quotes in some cases, that these women have who are represented in the book. It's vast. You forget that women were doing that many kinds of things over these 400 years.
Right, and I made sure to represent women from all classes,
yeah.
Not just educated, upper class women, of course, obviously not just white women, but women of all classes, women who didn't even have, weren't even literate in the traditional sense. So that was really an objective of mine, and I feel very satisfied that that's reflected there.
Yeah, very much so. I just want to go back to one thing you said earlier in terms of the official records of women. And, women's history wasn't regarded as important or necessary. So you have to dig around to find even records and even transcripts or documentation of what women were saying. I just want to say, and Jeff, I don't think got to the White House until after this had been rectified, but when I started in 1993, there were no people transcribing Hillary Clinton's speeches. The White House stenographers did not transcribe a First Lady's speeches. Now, let me remind you that at that time, Hillary Clinton had been put in charge of reforming 1/7 of the nation's economy, the healthcare system. And yet, somehow, whatever she said about that was not worth the valuable time of the White House stenographers to transcribe what she said. And so a small little coterie of young unpaid interns who were working at bars at night to be able to pay the rent would come in and transcribe these things, and that stayed the case for a few years until enough people raised a stink about it that we finally got her speeches transcribed. It's kind of insane when you really stop and think about it.
I point this out in the introduction to the book. If a woman was speaking, when a woman spoke, if an editor of a newspaper, which was almost always a man, there were, with a few exceptions, almost always a man, if that person didn't elect to send a journalist to cover that event, or if there was no stenographer, if it was a conference, if there was no stenographer writing down what that woman said, then her words were not recorded. If her words were not recorded, then she wouldn't be, or a journalist didn't write them down, she wouldn't be quoted in the next day's paper. If she wasn't quoted in the next day's paper, then she wouldn't appear in other speeches, her comments wouldn't get disseminated in our discourse, and of course she wouldn't end up in the anthology books or the history books. So there is a chain, an information chain, and there are gatekeepers all along the way, and those gatekeepers, for a very long time in our history, did not think what women had to say mattered.
Yeah, and I regret to say that as much progress as we've made, it's still a challenge, and we'll get to that in a second. You made the point to me when I first received the galley of the books a while back that you don't really have to read this book cover to cover. It's not a narrative per se. It's a collection of speeches, and yet I sort of did try to go through it chronologically. And I found that really interesting in the sense of, first of all, oh my God, how far have we not come? So many of the issues are the same. So many of the challenges are the same for women. So many of the ways that these things are being articulated are the same. So that there is a continuum. But I think one of the points you've made is that each speech builds to the next speech to the next speech. Can you talk about that a little bit? The sort of historical arc of these speeches.
I think it's in a kind of funny way. It is a book of speeches, and speeches are at the center of the project. But in a funny way, if you just read the introductions and don't even bother with the speeches, you really get the sweep of history, the sweep of American history, and you see that at every critical juncture, at every major historical point, women were speaking, but you also see an increase of access, an increase of authority, an increase of reach, you might say, for their ideas. But you start out in the beginning when women were were completely at the mercy, subjected to domination by male authority, and the progress you see is the progress that parallels the progress that women have made in this country. And so I find that it's a very heartening story. You get to the end and you feel an enormous sense of pride in the progress, in the arc of the progress, but you also come away with a sense of enormous obligation or debt to the women at the beginning. You realize that the only reason that we are here today, that all of us can speak and have our voices heard and matter, is because these women did it earlier. So, I mean, that's true of all history. That's why we learn history, because we have a greater appreciation for how we got to be where we are today. But it's especially true in this, in this little niche of a niche, which is women's voices.
Well, there's something that was almost counterintuitive to me in this, and it's not really, but it sort of felt that way going through the biographies and the speeches themselves. And that's that on the one hand, I'm a speechwriter. I've spent a lot of my life as I had not heard of a lot of these women of the 75. I didn't know about their speeches, which tells you something. And I don't think it's because I don't care. I think it's because there was no place to access them. They weren't widely disseminated. And so going through the anthology, you do realize, my God, women have been speaking out for a long time in a lot of venues, in a lot of ways, and very forcefully at great risk to themselves. That's the one hand. But on the other hand, we don't know it. We don't know about them. So it's a weird kind of counterintuitive thing. And you're saying it's because people haven't paid attention to them.
Yes. And my deepest hope is that this book will be a catalyst for integration of these women's voices into the curricula, into the courses, into the history books, into the civics classes, into the American Studies classes, and also into rhetoric, study of rhetoric. What is it? The study of when ministers or preachers learn, what is that word? When they learn how to give homiletics. Oh, that's right, homiletics. I know, I'm very close with a friend who teaches homiletics. I think these speeches should be an example for women in all of those fields. And it should be kind of an adjunct to the traditional history books that have left out women altogether. So yes, on the one hand, it's a heartening story. On the other hand, it is kind of appalling that when you see the extent of the omission.
Mm-hmm. So forgive me, all of you, for a little self-promotion here, but I'm working on a book at the moment that actually has a little bit to do with this, in the sense that it's really about what happens to women when they do assert their voices and try to claim power in a traditional domain of male political power. In my case, it's about Hillary Clinton and the women around her in the White House in her term as First Lady. And I think some of you probably remember what happened to her when she tried to do things and got out of line and did things differently. And it wasn't all very pretty. And that has happened to a lot of women over time. So women have taken great risks to speak out. And there are a number of examples of not just nasty, we all know about nasty name calling in the political sphere all too well in the last few years, but nasty name calling, vitriol, a lot of sort of sexualizing of women, turning them into men. They must be like men if they speak out. Comments, and this happened to Hillary all the time, about their voice. I forget whether it was Angelina Grimke or one of the speeches in your book. The speaker was criticized for the quality and tone of her voice. And then violence.
By the way, Angelina Grimke, that would have been 1860s. 1860s.
Yeah. So even then, women, if they spoke out, they had, a nasty voice, an angry voice, an aggressive voice, whatever it was. But there was also violence directed at them. And I think it's important to think about that in the current moment.
Well, absolutely. There was nastiness of all sorts, but there were projectiles hurled at them. One time Fanny Wright was giving a speech, and somebody turned out the gas, and the hall was plunged into darkness. Angelina Grimke, when she spoke at Pennsylvania Hall, there were rocks. She was speaking to a mixed audience, a black and white audience, and she was talking about abolition, which was, anti-slavery, which was extremely controversial in Philadelphia in 1848. I think it was 1848. And There were rocks hurled at the beginning at the windows, and they were chased out of the building. And the next day, the building was burned down, burned to the ground. Let's see. Oh, there's a famous story about Sojourner Truth. One time she was speaking, and like you said, they used to call it, "Are you a man? Are you a man?" And she just ripped open her blouse. No, she's not a man. And then, let's see, I was thinking of another story. Christabel Pankhurst was giving a speech one time in Birmingham, and someone threw a dead mouse at her. I collect these stories, but they're really
Angelina
kind of
Grimke had a water hose fired on her through a window or something, right?
Her daughter writes about that. It's a famous story. Yeah,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
was speaking. It was the dead of winter, and somebody broke the window behind her and poured water over her. And her daughter writes that she just took her shawl and wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and went on with her speech.
I think it's, it's easy to overstate what all of that means, but right now we're in a moment in this country where violence against women is not a trivial matter. It just isn't. And to see this sort of historical precedence and the fact that we're still dealing with it. You also have book banning, Margaret Sanger's and book banning. And you've got climate activism and systemic racism. All the topics of today that are sort of seminal are covered at some point in our history by these amazing women who were courageous enough to speak out. And I'm wondering if well, first of all, how did you winnow this down to 75, and why 75?
Well, how did I? With difficulty.
Yeah, I'll bet.
And why 75? I first started when I initially was thinking about the idea and kind of kicking it around with my publisher. I suggested 35. And then quickly we went up to 50. So it was 50. It was 50 for a long time. I did a Kickstarter campaign to raise some money to, and to create an audience for the project. And I promoted it as 50 speeches. And then after we raised that money and I actually sat down to compile the book, I created an Excel spreadsheet and started at the beginning. And for the first, I would say, 100 years, it was pretty easy. There weren't that many examples, and I was just filling in the blanks. But then when you get to about the 1830s, 1840s, anti-slavery, abolition, temperance, and then during the Civil War, Clara Barton, Harriet Livermore, there were, Anna Dickinson. There were a number of very prominent speakers during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, of course, women's rights, the vote started heating up the issue, right through to World War I, and all of a sudden there was a deluge. Mm-hmm. So I had a spreadsheet, and I was looking for that diversity that I mentioned, and I just kept filling in women and then crossing out women and filling in women and crossing out women. And the ones that ended up on the cutting floor really, really bother me. It breaks my heart that Emma Goldman is not in this.
I wanted to ask you, I think that would be the hardest thing, is letting go of people who deserve to be in it. So Emma Goldman, why? And what would you have said?
Well, I was trying to represent that period. Now, Emma Goldman spoke about birth control and got arrested for speaking about birth control before Margaret Sanger did. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm gonna say, like maybe 1912, something like that. Emma Goldman started talking about birth control, but she also was anti-conscription, anti-World War I. She was an anarchist. She spoke about anarchism. She also spoke about literature, and she spoke in English, but also Yiddish. She gave speeches in Yiddish, and maybe Russian too. And she was really quite brilliant. And why did I leave her out? Because in the end, I decided to include Jeanette Rankin, mm-hmm. who was our first female congresswoman, and she also was against World War I. She cast a famous vote against World War I and World War II. And she made this speech that's in the book in which she argues, it's the end of the war, end of World War I, and she said, it was testimony before Congress, and she said, here you have all of these thousands of women who have sacrificed and stepped up during the war and served their country, gentlemen, mm-hmm. and now you would deny them the vote? They've been fighting for democracy abroad, gentlemen, and now you would deny them the vote mm-hmm. here in America. And somehow I thought, Jeanette Rankin, Emma Goldman, anarchist, patriot, I just thought, I'd better put in Jeanette Rankin. I just couldn't. It really came down to one or the other because I couldn't.
Splitting hairs.
Yeah, and anyway, so I have to say that once I compiled the list, I just had to go back and add more. And so it went to 62, and then it was 65, then it was 74. As it is, as it is now, I have two versions of a speech by Sojourner Truth.
I was going to ask you about that.
The original one, and then, of course, the bastardized version. So, yeah, it was, I could easily have done 100, but then it would have been approaching doorstop territory.
Yeah, no, 75 is a good number, it seems. I mean, I just wondered how you arrived at it and how hard that must have been to win it and how painful it must be to have to give up speeches that are worthy and compelling. And I'm wondering how you think about, you do what a lot of historians now must do, which is to really look at the nuances of some of these historical figures. They weren't all people to be lionized. They did, Meg Margaret Sanger did amazing things. She is the godmother of birth control in this country, but she was in favor of eugenics. And you talk about that in the biography of her. And I think you were careful to sort of try to make sure you were reflecting these people in their full portraits. When we look at these speeches, should we be looking at them only in the context of the moment in which they were given? Or how much should we apply a lens of history? Because I think sometimes, unfairly, we apply the lens of modern history in a way that dismisses some of the good things that people do.
Right. I mean, I think in a shorthand way, you could say people are getting canceled because they hold views 100 years ago that don't seem right today.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly that that's not appropriate, that we really do need to situate each person within the time period that he or she was living. Mm-hmm. But it's undeniable at the same time that the people that we look to the past that we look to the past for inspiration from, to draw inspiration from, and to inspire us, had held views or articulated views that still inspire us today because they remain true today. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's a tension that all of us who care about history and look to the past to learn from have to navigate. I mean, person by person, we really have to. It's quite delicate territory to say who endures mm-hmm. as a hero, or who endures as someone to look up to, and who do we decide, no, I think they're representative of views that we can leave behind, mm-hmm. because we have to go forward. We have to progress as a society, as a culture, as a species. There have to be ideas that we champion and other ideas that we leave behind. And the people who embodied or articulated those ideas, they reflect humanity. And they reflect all of us in the sense that all of us have hold views and engage in activities that tomorrow and next year, sometimes I think, what are people going to think about us, that we were eating meat? Right. Right. How is the future going to judge us? None of us has that ability to look ahead and see, but I think we have to have some kind of curious combination of compassion, judgment, curiosity to look at these people and recognize them in their full, flawed but admirable complexity.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job of that. I mean, some of these, these are complex figures, some of them, living in really challenging times, dealing with all sorts of things we don't have to deal with now. And it's hard to always to parse that. And I think I'm really glad that you did, because it gives a much richer and truer portrait of the person, the speech, and the context of it. And sort of in the same vein, how do you, when you're judging speeches but also making this collection, how do you measure impact? And was that a criterion for inclusion in your anthology?
Well, impact, as I do talk about this a little bit in the introduction, impact is hard to measure sometimes. There are people there are women whose words had an immediate impact. The one that comes to mind most readily is Clara Shortridge Foltz. Mm-hmm. She's the first woman lawyer in California, and the first woman lawyer on the West Coast. She introduced a bill to allow women to take the bar exam in California, and then she fought all the way up to the Supreme Court in California so that women could practice law in California. So she was intrepid, she was trailblazing, she was dogged and determined, and in 1893, she stepped up to the microphone at the Chicago World's Exposition and made the argument that we needed a public defender system, because she had been in the courtroom and she had seen the extent to which an indigent, a poor defendant was completely steamrolled by the prosecutorial power. And that idea took hold in America. That was 1893. I believe it was the 1920s when the first office of public defender opened in San Francisco, and she was alive to see that. So she changed the world with her speech. The speech was a articulation or reflection of her ideas that she gained in the court. I mean, in the court of law, where she saw what happened with her own, with her own eyes, her own professional experience. So to me, that's the perfect example of a woman who used her experience, her thought leadership, so to speak, to make a proposition. And that actually came into law and made societal change. But then there are all these other women who it's not so easy for whom it's not so easy to measure their impact. But if a woman introduces an idea, or any speaker introduces an idea, and it percolates throughout our society, it advances our ideas a little bit, that idea gets taken up by someone else, and it's taken up by someone else, that too has an impact. That too has an impact. And as I mentioned in the introduction, an Emma Goldman or Voltairine de Cleyre or Kate O'Hara, all these anarchists of the 1920s, if they did not persuade a large portion of America to become anarchist, nevertheless, the impact of their thinking about social legislation, about the need to protect the indigent, the poor, about immigrants, about our attitude towards all these ideas were part of their political agenda that crept into our thinking. So even if the entirety of their ideas were not adopted, they helped move the needle forward. And that too, even though we can't measure it with the tape measure, matters.
Well, and you're making an important point. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, now is a good time to start migrating toward the microphone, and we'll go to you in a second. Your point, which is great, is that you don't have to be famous and have a big fancy platform to make a difference, right?
Right.
And as in some of those examples you just mentioned. And then there are women who do have a platform, and how do they use it?
And even if a woman introduces ideas that are considered outlandish and way far afield, nevertheless, those ideas are do make an impact and are picked up in the discourse. So I believe that all those women in the book, all the 75 who I chose, in some way their ideas did ripple through and are pertinent today.
One woman who had a platform and made a difference obviously was Eleanor Roosevelt, and the speech that you include from 1940 about her kind of manifesto on civil rights, that speech could be given today, literally, almost word for word. Don't you think?
Yes, I do, and that was a very hard decision for me, because really the speech that Eleanor Roosevelt, you could make the argument that it was a more important speech was the one that she made in 1948 about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the one that's included in most anthologies, and I really could go back and forth. But the reason I included this one is because I so admire the way in which Eleanor Roosevelt pushed forward the social agenda about her vision of America as a place where civil rights were extended to everyone, and specifically to Black Americans.
Right.
And she pushed this agenda at a time when her husband either did not want to or wasn't able to for political reasons. And of course, for much of the presidency, he was preoccupied with the war, and he had to build a coalition for the foreign policy. But on the social front, she was constantly pushing ahead this idea that Black Americans were denied their civil rights, and that all of us were responsible for changing that. She would do things like, of course, very famously, she invited Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial when Marian Anderson was denied the ability to sing by the Daughters at Constitution Hall by DAR, right? So that was one thing that's well known. But she also befriended Mary McLeod Bethune, and she made sure that she was photographed with her. She wanted everyone to see that she was friends with a Black woman.
Right.
And that's important. She also, as I mentioned there, she also invited some little Black children, some black girls, to have a picnic on the lawn of the White House. And that made a lot of people angry. And I wouldn't be surprised if it also made her husband angry, because he would get flack for it. He'd get political flack for it. But she felt very strongly that it was her role to push these things forward. And so that's why I chose that speech, but it was a close call.
No, I was really glad you did, because you're right. The 1948 speech is much better known, and this one has a lot of nuance. But it could be given, I really recommend you read it. It could be given word for today. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. Thank you so much for being here. This really was a wonderful discussion. My name is Nathan. My name is Nathan Weisler, and I am I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College, and I'm hoping to attend teaching college and to teach American and civil rights history. My question is, in looking at the many different and inspiring speeches in the book, one individual who particularly stood out for me is Dorothy Thompson, and her reporting and the real courage she showed in her work in Nazi Germany and her reporting on Kristallnacht. I was wondering, what did you find throughout your research? What did you find to be particularly inspiring about Dorothy Thompson? Would you be able to speak some about her and about Dorothy Thompson and what you found most interesting about her?
Oh, thank you so much for asking about her. I'm such a fan of Dorothy Thompson, and she's so little known today. I don't know, somebody must be working on a biography about her, because she is a great subject. She went to Europe and became a correspondent at a time when, she didn't have any journalism experience. She just went over to Europe, became a correspondent, and found herself face to face with Hitler. I mean, she got an one-on-one interview with Hitler, and she very famously underestimated him. She thought he was she called him a little man. But of course, subsequently, this was like 33 or 1933, 34, something like that, before he became the figure that he later became, before he became chancellor. But she was there on the ground. She saw the rise of fascism. She saw the rise of the National Socialists, and she reported on it. And as it went on, the situation went on, she became the voice of outrage. She actually was kicked out of Nazi Germany. The Gestapo kicked her out. But she reported from the States about Nazi Germany. And the speech that's in this collection is, it was another one that I had a close call between two different speeches. I was trying to decide between one or the other, but the one I included is the one which she gives testimony before Congress about Roosevelt, FDR's plan to enlarge the Supreme Court, and she was very much against that, which Jeff wrote a book about.
Right. She
was very much against that, and as she explains in this testimony, but she explains that her reason why is because she thought it was so important that the populace, the public, held these institutions in respect. And she felt that if FDR could just expand the court and it would be seen as a naked political play, that it would undermine the legitimacy and the respect of the court. And she said, she drew an analogy to Nazi Germany, that's what the Nazis did. One by one, they took these pillars of society, the courts, the press, the civil rights, they took the legislation, and civil rights, they took these one by one and destroyed their credibility, and that's how they made their political hay. And so the other speech that I was really wanted to use was one in which she called for support for Herschel Greenspan. He was the young man who killed the German attaché, and his family was caught up in the Holocaust. And anyway, she made an appeal on behalf of him, because she wanted him to get a fair trial in Nazi Germany, which sadly he did not. But she took so many courageous stands over and over and over as she stood up for unpopular causes.
And I think you mentioned that in the biography of her in the book.
I stuck it in at the bottom.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's a great question. Thank you so much. Were you in line?
Yes.
Great.
So this book is very exciting. I have two questions, if possible. The first is, what are the most important things you learned through this process? And the second is, what messages do you think this book holds for young women?
Well, actually, I think I can answer them both with one answer.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in history, and this book is an outgrowth of my lifelong interest in history. But I really think that what we learn from it is something quite profound and present, for the present, which is that when we look in the past and we see that things were different, and we see that they are different today, that we aren't living in the same place. The past is a different country. We realize that it's different today because people took action then. People took steps, they used their voices, they stepped forward, they created projects, they pushed for legislation that creates the world that we live in today. So if there's problems, challenges, issues that we want to address today, we can draw the message, the obvious conclusion of that from that is that we can change them ourselves, that the world doesn't have to be, the world is not static, that it's ever changing, and that we too can be agents of change in our own way. And that's the message that I want young people to have, particularly young women, because I know young women do in aggregate, not everyone, but in aggregate they have a harder time using their voices than men do. But I want everyone to feel that sense of empowerment that things don't I mean, none of us would want to go back to, I mean, I was thinking about this today, just even a few years, none of us would want to go back to before the Me Too movement, right? I mean, the world is changing all the time. It's progressing. And so when you look back at the way things were, you realize, yes, we can change the future. We can change the future.
Thank you.
I just am going to jump in quickly until, do you have a question?
I'm happy to wait.
Okay. Just jump in with one thought that came up while you were answering. Do people with platforms have an obligation to use their voices and speak out? I'm thinking of, you include Oprah Winfrey's speech about Me Too, which is pretty courageous. She was going to not make a lot of people happy with that. You have Michelle Obama. I mean, you could pick up, I'm sure you had trouble picking a Michelle Obama speech, but you picked one, that famous graduation speech she gave at CCNY, where she really talked about the nation's diversity in the middle of the 2016 presidential campaign, when that ideal was being roundly assaulted by a certain Republican presidential candidate. Hillary Clinton's Beijing speech. Did these women, did they have an obligation to do what they did, do you feel?
Oh, I strongly feel that they do. They did have an obligation, and that we all have an obligation. Mm-hmm. I really do. I mean, does every single person need to speak? Well, some people don't like to speak. Some people hate to speak in public. But a voice is, after all, a voice is a metaphor. Mm-hmm. A voice can be the sounds that come out of your mouth. A voice can be a speech or testimony. A voice can also be expressing an idea in some way. If you don't want to speak in public, you can write. Mm-hmm. You can support any number of causes, and that can be an expression, that can be a mode for using your voice. But yes, I think they do. I think we all have an obligation to use our voices.
Well, I'm thinking of Billie Jean King. I think she blurbed it, right? And how much she spoke out at great cost to her career and her financial well-being and everything else. And right now, I don't know how many of you are following the French Open tennis. Forgive me, I am. But there's a big dispute with one of the Belarusian players about whether she's speaking out enough. And the Ukrainian players will not shake her hand, and they're very angry about it. And there's a big debate going on about whether this Belarusian player should be saying more. It's a tough call. But I agree with you. I mean, I think people who have a platform should speak. I don't think they should hide behind the platform. You have a question.
Thank you. I think your point about the speeches made certainly over 200 years ago may not have gained traction at the time. Perhaps the women were sowing the seed for further social reform, in 10, 20, 30 years. I'm just interested in the research that you did, whether there was any... how long did that change take? Was it uniformly... I suppose it's not uniformly, but from the time that the women were making the speeches, raising the issues, did it take, a century or 50 years or 20 years for the cause to be taken on? And if there was any particular actions that they were taking to raise the profile of the issues they were making?
Well, that's a very complicated question. Yeah. And I don't think the answer can be as generalized or sweeping as you're suggesting, because I think you'd have to look at issues discretely, like one by one. But just take, for example, the case of women's suffrage. In America, women were pushing for the vote, campaigning, speaking for the vote for 70 years, 7 decades. In England, or the United Kingdom, I think it was about the same, a little longer, because it took them a little longer. I mean, just think about that. For something that seems so basic and so obvious today, it took them 7 decades to do that. Now, if you look at an issue like abolition, it also took many decades for that idea to prevail. I mean, the idea that one group of human beings shouldn't own another group of human beings, it took many decades for it. Seemed obvious to one group of people, but to the majority of society, it wasn't at all obvious. It was opponents of abolition believed that they had the right, the law was on their side. They believed that that was in the natural order of things. They believed that the Bible justified their position. I mean, it's astonishing to think of how obdurate, how durable some of the opposition to these ideas are that we take for granted today as basic human rights, as basic fundamental rights. So I don't think there's any one way to answer your question, but here's something to think about. One of the prophets, you might say, of the environmental movement is Rachel Carson, and she tragically died way too early. She died of cancer, but I have included her in this anthology with a commencement speech that she gave. But of course, Rachel Carson is known for sounding the alarm about pesticides and the damage that humankind was doing to our environment. And to our environment, by environment, she meant our species as well. She included humanity in the full scope of the planet. And her words were prophetic, but here we are today with a level of environmental degradation and fears about, the effects of climate change that are worse than ever. Worse than ever. So some of these issues have been resolved, but others are enduring, and we're still fighting for them.
Okay, thank you for that. I think I was, and that's really interesting that there wasn't one theme such as healthcare rights or social reform that gained traction quicker than others. So thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for being here. I greatly admire anyone who does the research for the women who haven't had light shown on them and are so deserving they have the light shown on them. So great kudos to you. You mentioned Grimke, and I assume that you read The Invention of Wings. I was drawn to Charleston last October for a wedding, and the family arranged a tour by a guide to follow the Grimke sisters' life there, which I would recommend to anyone. The tour guide is very high up in the tour guide society there, and I think she conducts like 19 different tours, and it was very informative. So is there any other Grimke book that you use for your research, or is it just that one?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm dying to go to Charleston. I haven't been, but I want to go so badly. Charleston and Savannah both. I know how much history there is there. There's a brand new book out about the Grimkes. Carrie Greenidge, did she come speak here? I'm sure that you must have her book. Her book is really a multi-generational study of the Grimke family.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But her book came out just recently, so I didn't use it as a source. But there are other wonderful books. Gerda Lerner wrote a wonderful book about the Grimke sisters back in the 1970s. There's quite a bit written about them. They're fascinating. Yes. And I know another historian who's working on a book about the two sisters, Angelina and Sarah, too. I'll tell you something interesting about them is that Sarah and Angelina Grimke, they were sisters from Charleston, for those of you who don't know, and they grew up in a slaveholding family. Their father was a judge in South Carolina, so a very distinguished family, and they rebelled against it. They rebelled against all the values of their family and their society around them, and they went to the East Coast and became Quakers and spent the rest of their life basically fighting against slavery. But both of them spoke. Sarah and Angelina both spoke, and both had reputations as fiery speakers. And to my knowledge, we have no speeches, none of Sarah's words at all. And I have about 5 speeches by Angelina one in this book, and about, I think, 5 or 6 in the speech bank, but it breaks my heart that we have none of Sarah's words. I do believe they remain somewhere, in some archive somewhere, or in some old newspaper somewhere. They'll turn up. So part of the mission of my book is to put out a call for researchers to keep looking for those important manuscripts.
I'd make a bet. If you go to Charleston, you'll find that in the libraries there or the research facilities. And if you make contact with the tour guide that I used, I'm sure there's a wealth of it right down there.
That's a good suggestion. I
Yeah.
will do that. It's
Yeah,
on my
so-
bucket list.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something interesting.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I was just talking to somebody who collects Americana, like a manuscript collector, and I asked him if he had any papers or manuscripts or documents related to women's oratory, and he said no. All kinds of Americana he has, all kinds of stuff from every, colonial period, early American Revolutionary period. No, nothing about women's oratory. Why not? He says it never comes up on the market. So I said, do you think it could be the case that it's there, but you just don't know what it is, so you're not looking for it? I mean, I'm sure these documents exist. I'm sure, but if if the tree falls in the forest, if the document exists but no one values it, no one thinks it puts a price tag on it, then no one's collecting it. And it's a paradox that they exist but they're not collectible.
Well, you're raising something that I recently spoke to somebody that I think some of you know. She teaches a class here, Betsy Griffith, the great feminist historian, who's just written a book called Formidable, which is a history of women's rights in America. And she was telling me that until there were women's studies in college, until there was a curriculum that actually acknowledged that women had their own history, none of this was ever found. None of these kinds of artifacts and documents were found or even looked for. But the reason they started getting looked for, and the reason that women's studies came into existence, is because men were shipped off to the Vietnam War in the 1960s, which left a lot of places open in graduate schools that women finally could fill. And when women went to graduate school, they wanted to study what they were interested in, and they were interested in their own history. And that's when there was a great, massive sort of undertaking, unspoken and unplanned, but of women researchers looking into family documents, letters, journals, the sorts of things that were tucked away in attics. And that produced a lot of material that otherwise would have just collected dust and nobody would have known about it.
Isn't it the case also that was coincident with, or maybe even causative with, the rise of what's called social history? Mm-hmm, yeah. The social history movement, like the 1960s, 1970s, right. When people, like history from the bottom up, not just the great men and the history from those who were in power or in upper echelons of society, but the mill workers, the farmers, the people who were the laborers.
I think that's true.
Prisoners.
I think her point was just that there are these documents. They're not official. They're in families' collections or so-and-so's letters, but they're there if people will start looking for them.
People will value them.
Yeah. No, exactly. You have a question. This may have to be our last question unless anybody runs to the microphone.
Thank you very much for being here and for writing this book. When you talked about your selection process, you talked about, I forget which decade it was, that it went from few speeches to many. And I'm curious to know, to what do you attribute that?
Well, I don't really have a specific answer. I think there was just more acceptance of women speakers. Probably around the 1840s, 1850s, there was just more and more women speaking and more acceptance of women speaking. And so more for me to choose from. But I think it's important to parse that a little bit and say there were women speaking earlier, but we don't have access to their speeches. We don't have them. So
do you think it was more platforms publishing them, external events?
I don't know, but there were specific. I don't exactly know how to answer the question. I'm not sure, and I'm also not a historian. I'm more of a dilettante, right? So I don't exactly know, but I do know.
Speechwriter, journalist. Yeah. That's all you need to know.
But just think about the fact that the temperance cause, initially men owned the temperance cause and they didn't want women to speak. But then women made incursions and very forcefully entered into the temperance cause and took it over, and women became the dominant voice in temperance. So there was the temperance cause that became a woman's cause, and there was the anti-abolition was very much became a woman's women-driven cause in an oratorical sense, and also, of course, women's rights. So maybe when those issues became more acceptable and women stepped forward to articulate those points of view, there were more women populating the lecterns and the platforms and the conferences and other venues like that.
Thank you.
I mean, also when you get to the 60s and 70s and 80s, there are just more women in public spaces doing things. There's starting to be more women lawyers. There's starting to be more women elected to office.
In the professions, yeah.
In the professions, which doesn't account for more working class women, but.
So, Lissa, to change the subject just for a minute, could you speak just a little bit about the speech by Hillary that's in the book that you know so much about? I'm really
How many
would love
hours
it-
do we have?
No, I would really love it if you would share with me and with the audience a little bit about. Tell us
Okay,
what speech I'm referring to.
Okay, thank you. It's very kind of you to ask. This is really meant to be about Donna and her book, but you're very kind to ask. This was Hillary Clinton's speech in 1995 to the Fourth World Conference on Women that was sponsored by the United Nations. It's famous for a line, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And what's interesting about the speech, and I think its durability comes from, well, first of all, it was very controversial that she was going to go to Beijing at all. And there was a period leading up to the speech where it didn't look like she was going. In fact, nobody wanted her to go except her husband, and her staff. Everybody else, including presidential advisors in the West Wing, the State Department, people in Congress on the left and the right. And the reason was that the Chinese, a couple of months before this conference, did something really dumb, which was to arrest a guy who had emigrated to the United States and had come back and snuck into the country, and they accused him of spying, and then that threw Hillary's trip into the air. I think what happened was eventually, after several months of playing chicken with the U.S. government over whether she would go or not, they realized, and remember, this was China in 1995. This was China just coming out of the dark ages, seeking legitimacy on the global stage, wanting to be taken seriously. And I think they realized if Hillary Clinton doesn't come, we're not going to get all this credit for hosting this big United Nations conference. We better just put up with her. So they convicted this guy, Harry Wu, and kicked him out. And then she had the green light. That was about 11 days before the speech. But my point is that it was a very fraught setting for this speech. She had been blamed for the demise of healthcare reform. She had been blamed for the democratic disasters in the 1994 midterms. She was just sort of trying to change direction and step into international issues, social development, women's rights, human rights. And this was going to be a big stepping stone for her to kind of get her wheels back and be able to speak out about something she cared deeply about. But then it became so fraught. And when the Chinese arrested Harry Wu, it just drew more attention to this conference. It actually amplified attention on the conference. And the West Wing was very nervous about her going. And actually in my book, I was joking to Donna, I have a whole chapter about this, the making of this speech. So it was a tense situation. And what was great about the speech was that she, and I talk about this, she was determined to be absolutely unequivocal and unwavering and unambiguous in her support of women's rights. And you have in the little précis that you do with the speech this litany that she did about the abuses and injustices toward women around the world. And it was, I would have to say, the most graphic depiction of what women go through in their lives around the world that had ever been spoken in that kind of a setting. And it was, it was very compelling and very powerful. And then that line just crazily became this mantra. And literally for years afterward, when she would travel around the world, and I don't know, I went to 65 countries with her or something crazy, people would run up clutching copies of that speech. And they would be saying, women's rights are human rights are women's rights. And it was just, we were all sort of taken aback because we knew it was a good line, but we didn't think it was that good. And anyway, so the speech has had a lot of durability.
Did you go to Beijing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, believe me, yes, I did. There's a whole story about what was happening while she's giving speech. I'll let you wait for my book for that.
I'll be here.
Anyway, I do think it was, if not her best, one of her two best speeches ever. largely because of her. I just want to point out.
Also, one of the points that I make in my introduction to that speech is that she wrote in an essay quite recently about it that she was nervous before she gave it. And I love that because so many women that I coach today, so many women in my workshops are nervous about speaking. And I want people to know that, yes, Hillary Clinton was nervous about giving her speech.
There was a lot writing on it. There was a lot writing on her, and there was a lot writing on it. And anyway, I do talk about that. I talk about the challenge of writing that speech for a woman in that situation. So we can talk more about it whenever this book is ever finished, which hopefully will not be. Hopefully we'll all still be around for it. But Donna, thank you so much. What a great conversation. As I said, we could go on for hours. The book is Speaking While Female. I hope you all have a copy or get copies. It's a great gift for all sorts of people. And Don will be happy to sign up here at the table. We can't thank you enough for coming, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you for running the best indie bookstore ever.
Aww.
Thank you.